like there was a moment where I was afraid to go into my backyard. And
Wow.
there was a moment when I did go into my backyard with my son, and we heard two gunshots, and quickly went inside when all this was going on.
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman, Executive Director of 97%. We're a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun-related deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate and talk about the hot-button issues, but without the screaming. Later in this episode, Dr. Michael Siegel, a renowned researcher and professor at Tufts University, will join us for the latest edition of Siegel's Scope. But first, my guest today is a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal, awarded to her by President Joe Biden this past January for her exemplary public service to advance free and fair elections. A Marshall Scholar at Oxford University with a JD from Harvard Business School, she investigated domestic terrorist cells in Alabama and was the youngest woman to lead a top 100 law school in the United States before entering the Michigan State Legislature. In 2018, she was elected Michigan Secretary of State, and in 2022, she was reelected by a 14-point margin, the largest vote margin and vote share of any statewide candidate in Michigan that year. Jocelyn Benson, welcome to TAG.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Secretary of State is not normally associated with gun issues, but it seems as though you, in Michigan especially, are on top of all of the major issues that are going on around the country and actually doing something about many of these major issues. But you, Secretary Benson, what you're doing in Michigan, it seems just as if it's having huge national implications. Can you just tell us first, what is it about the Secretary of State role in Michigan that seems to be so high profile, so different? You just got the Medal of Honor, for example, from the president. That's not something normally associated with state secretaries of state. So what's going on in Michigan? What's unique about your role?
I think it's two things. One, Michigan itself is very much a microcosm for the country, whether it's our demographics, our history, the geography of the state, our location, smack dab in the middle, more or less, of the country, and everything that we touch as a result of it. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which what happens in Michigan and the problems we encounter and the problems we solve can both be a cautionary tale or in our case, a inspiration, we hope, or a guidebook for the rest of the country. And that's not just me, but our attorney general, our governor, our great legislative leaders, everything we're doing here. But underneath all of that is underneath every issue we care about, which is our democracy. And as the Secretary of State, my job is to protect democracy. I'm the chief election officer for the state of Michigan, much like many secretaries of state are across the country. And so in that regard, my job is to make sure that every voice is heard, every vote is counted, that citizens know their pathway to power and policy that reflects their will and values comes through the ballot box. And by making that clear and real for citizens, we can then increase participation, increase engagement, and increase the likelihood of a more responsive and reflective government. And that's really what our story is in Michigan: a healthy democracy leading to policies that reflect not just what the will of the people really want, but good policy overall to make our state thrive, even in times like these.
And I have to say, maybe I'm supposed to be unbiased, but I'm definitely biased about, the job you're doing and Governor Whitmer is doing and Dana Nessel is doing and Haley Stevens and Hillary Scholten. And somehow Michigan has this down, and Stephanie Chang, in a way that seems very unique in the country. And I do want to ask you, Secretary Benson, why Michigan? Why are there so many good elected officials? Why is Michigan leading the way in the country more than any other state?
I think it's also related to two things. One, Michigan is run by and large by women, and it's also have a very racially diverse leadership. And to me, that really reflects what happens when you open the doors of governance to everyone. And also what happens when women in particular lead. I mean, for a long time, we were the only state where you had a woman in charge of the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice, and a woman in charge of every executive office in the state. We now have, in addition to that, a woman Senate Majority Leader in Winnie Brinks, our first ever in history. And so the story of Michigan very much is connected to what happens when women are in charge. And then other state-wide leadership roles, our lieutenant governor position and currently the Speaker of the House are African-American men. So what we have is a true diverse leadership coalition that from which we govern. And it's enabled us to become teammates in governance and alliances. We all are different. We all bring to the table different perspectives and ideals and ideas, but we have a commonality of understanding the needs both of marginalized communities, historically voiceless communities, and the importance of ensuring every voice is heard, that the will of the people rule the day, and that we fight to amplify people's voices and thereby the will of the people in our work. The other aspect of all this is citizens, and really how we all got here into our positions are citizen engagement. And really, democracy began to transform in Michigan after the 2016 election cycle, when citizens just worked together to build a grassroots coalition that emerged from a Facebook post to create a citizens redistricting commission in our state that now enables citizens to independently and in a bipartisan way draw the lines for our legislative and congressional districts. On top of that, citizens also amended our state constitution to have expanded options to vote, like absentee voting and now early voting, and also expanded options to register, automatic voter registration, election day registration. And as a result, we've had the highest voter turnout elections during my tenure that we've ever had, and Michigan leads the country for youth voter turnout.
Oh, is that right?
So all of that combined really underscores how we've been able to have leaders that represent the will of the people, but the story ultimately is about citizens taking charge of their democracy and leading the way.
So I'm not going to have a lot of Michigan citizens on this podcast today, so I want to brag about you specifically, though. So your governor said that the experiences of the 2020 election were so harrowing that it really forced people to, if they didn't know how to lead, become leaders, and if they were leaders, to really show how. And there were a lot of issues with, people wanted to kidnap the governor, for example. With gun violence, can you talk a little bit about how harrowing, and you won the Medal of Honor, as we mentioned before, how scary that experience was for 2020 and what you're doing about guns near polling places? Can we talk about that?
Yeah, I think rooted in a lot of the challenges that began once the former president, Trump, really started attacking the governor and then subsequently myself and the attorney general. And in really kind of gender-laden, misogynistic ways, trying to undercut our leadership and lie about our work to, in my case, expand democracy and ensure people could vote in the midst of a pandemic. Out of that, and out of his sort of focus on us, the women of Michigan, came and what was followed by a lot of attacks and challenges and threats from a well-documented, coordinated plot to try to kidnap the governor that was very real, and that it wasn't just a sort of plan. People were planning and acting on it. To people showing up, armed protesters outside my home in the dark of night in December of 2020, shouting in bullhorns to demand that I face them and overturn the results of the presidential election.
What do you do when that happens? What do you do? You're in your house. What do you do?
Well, what's challenging is you don't always know what to do. The uncertainty of the moment. Are people going to storm my home?
Right.
I mean, for a good 45 minutes, people were all that stood between myself and my family and those armed protesters was one neighborhood security guard on the doorstep of our porch. So was a stray bullet going to enter our home? Was it going to, we didn't know. And so it's very harrowing. I as you know, started my career in Montgomery, Alabama, investigating hate groups and white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations around the country. And it was being there and really seeing I was undercover, the perniciousness of that hate and how it can translate and transform itself into violence, that had taught me that these threats are real and we need to take them seriously. What being in Alabama also taught me is the history of the civil rights movement, and particularly Selma, which gave me a real sense of the violence and the threats that everyone who's ever stood on the front lines defending democracy throughout history has had to endure. So in that moment, in that evening, I was, focused on keeping my son safe, running the bathwater loudly so he couldn't hear the shouts outside my home. He was 4 years old at the time. We were decorating the Christmas tree and getting ready to put him to bed. But at the same time, I had this moment about halfway through the experience where I realized these folks outside, they're not protesting me. They're protesting the will of the people. They're protesting our voters. They're protesting democracy. And I found a lot of strength in that recognition, that connecting what I was enduring to what others have endured throughout history to defend democracy and defend the will of the voters. And from there, developed a great sense of pride and determination to ensure that we would not just certify the results of the election, but protect them at all costs.
But Secretary, in those 45 minutes, you're knowing that these people are fighting against the will of the people is not going to protect you from a bullet that goes into your house. So are you literally you're have the bathwater on, but where are you and your husband in this scenario?
The back of the home. I mean, I should say this was not the only time we've dealt with the potential for gun violence or threats of gun violence in our lives, at our home, or elsewhere. This is the one that is most well known because there's video footage of it, right?
Right.
So there's it's sort of like almost a constant sense of being on guard that we tapped into that evening, and you develop procedures to kind of get to a safe place and a plan if things escalate. I was actually on the phone for a lot of the night with the Attorney General, who would sort of find out what was happening and then call. And so trying to basically manage through the experience, try to keep as safe as possible and just be prepared for anything. My husband was also in the military, and there were days when he was serving in Afghanistan when he would reach me or call, or we would talk, and he would talk about also being targeted by the Taliban with machine guns. So we're also just no strangers to just the fear that gun violence endures and the strength you have to find to work through that fear and still do your work, whether you're on the battlefield literally in Afghanistan or on the battlefield defending democracy here in Michigan. So all of that has created a kind of, I don't want to say familiarity, because that's not what it, right, but just a preparedness for moments like that. And so we got through it. And then after the Michigan State Police ultimately arrived 45 minutes later, and then people dissipated, and we met with them, and we added more cameras to our house, more security. You just add more procedures in place. A few months later, there was a threat that I think someone posted on social media. I've never talked about this publicly, that they had found a way to kind of basically shoot me in my backyard. And we had to have people come out and figure out where that location might be, that someone might be targeting me from. And so there was a moment where I was afraid to go into my backyard.
Wow.
And there was a moment when I did go into my backyard with my son, and we heard 2 gunshots and, quickly went inside when all this was going on. So that is the state of anxiety that we're constantly in. It shouldn't have to be this way.
Right.
But at the same time, my job is to protect and defend the will of the voters, and I'm going to do it no matter how many threats and no matter how much potential violence comes my way.
This is unbelievable. I would have quit this job in 30 seconds if it was me, by the way. So, I mean, God bless you for doing it. When you signed on, when you ran for this job, you run to help on the state election stuff, but you didn't know all this was going to happen. You run to modernize the DMV. I mean, it's not, this is not what you're expecting when you get into this, right?
No, in fact, I was elected in the same election when citizens voted to change our constitution to put citizens in charge of redistricting, which came through my office. We oversaw the creation of the state's first independent citizen-led redistricting panel. And we also had to implement the will of the voters, no reason absentee voting, and all of the amendments that they voted for that year. So I came into my office in 2019 incredibly excited to really demonstrate, and incredibly prepared to demonstrate, how we implement all these policies with an eye towards increasing the engagement of voters all across Michigan and making government work for them by making the DMV work better, which we've done. We've transformed how we deliver customer service for drivers and licensees throughout our state, and that has also demonstrated that when you vote, you can get results. So that is and still is my North Star, all of that. And what has sort of happened on that path, the pandemic,
Right.
the threats from the former president and his most ardent supporters, and a number of other things, has been part of our story, but not the whole story. The other part of it is our democracy's gotten stronger. More people are voting than ever before. Citizens are drawing our district lines, and we're seeing policies to increase the safety of environments from schools to workplaces also be enacted. So there's a lot of good things happening in our state. And what history teaches us is when you do see progress, you also see that backlash. And so we have to be prepared, if we're going to fight for progress and change, to endure that backlash, whatever form it manifests itself in, because that's the story of progressive change in our country throughout its history.
So now we get toward 2024, and it's possible, even likely, that there'll be some type of contentious election again. How do we protect people from gun violence at the polls, for example, in Michigan? What do we do about that?
Well, we work on a number of things. One, we work with local law enforcement to make sure we have a rapid response plan in place in case there is any threat, intimidation, or attack on our infrastructure, our cybersecurity, or at the polls or elections or election locations where people are voting. So we have that sort of protective net and that rapid response plan in place. And then from a deterrent standpoint, we're working to enact state policies in advance of 2024 that will, among other things, ban the use of firearms, open carry or concealed, within 100 feet of any place where people are voting. In some cases, that's already in place in Michigan, because if a polling place is in a school and the school bans the firearm or open carry, then that policy it oversees the polling place. But it's not consistent throughout our state, and we need one consistent role. So that's one of the policies we hope to see, and notably states like Texas and Georgia and Florida have that policy in place. So we're going to try to match them and be like Texas in that regard and have a ban on firearms in places where people are voting. And then a number of other things to increase penalties for threats of election workers. We're also working to pass a Michigan Voting Rights Act that will create a state cause of action if there's any voter intimidation or voter suppression tactics, which we see as threats of violence as one of those things. So, shield and a sword, essentially, to protect and also seek accountability if there are problems. And I think the other thing I'll say, though, as a sort of footnote to that, is the people of democracy have endured great threats, from poll workers to clerks to secretaries of state to the voters themselves over the last several years. But we've also gotten, at least I've seen in Michigan and in many extents nationwide, stronger as a community, more focused and determined to not allow anyone to threaten our votes and take them away. And so I'm also confident that energy, that determination that we're seeing from citizens all across the state, red, white, blue, purple, all backgrounds, that will also ensure we get through this moment and see a healthier democracy on the other side.
It's, I was talking to somebody today, Jocelyn, about the knocking on doors. In the 2020 election, it was during COVID, there wasn't a lot of that. In the 2024 election, there's going to be a lot of it. And some people are concerned as they go to these states. In some of these states, you see that you knock on a door like in Florida and somebody shoots you if you're driving in the wrong driveway. How should people feel about doing that kind of work for the 2024 election?
It's really harrowing because we're in this moment where we're not trusting each other, where the divisiveness that we've seen manifest itself in our political arena and social media is coming to fruition through violence in our communities all across our country. And it's created a lot of fear and the need to really be prepared for those things. I think it's incumbent upon local leaders and us as state executives to really create a better environment, a safer environment where people can go door to door, whether it's canvassing for candidates or simply to communicate with their neighbors as a community. that we rebuild that sense of community and togetherness, because I think that's got to be a part of it. It's going to, be bigger than just ensuring people can canvass. But it's beyond that. There's a need for more, frankly, policies in place to protect against gun violence, but also, I think in this cycle in particular, people going door to door to educate voters or talk about or meet with them to talk about policies at stake or candidates on the ballot are going to have to, be prepared for challenges that go far beyond what oftentimes are the challenges, which are, the dogs and there's always a little bit of harrowing.
Yeah.
I think candidates themselves can take a role as well in communicating to citizens and writ large and trying to say, these people may be coming to your door. This is going to, this is part of American life. This is how democracy works. Let's not threaten them. And I think candidates on both sides of the aisle can make statements like that to help create an air of safety.
Yeah.
But we all have to be vigilant because it's going to be.
Yeah, usually when you're knocking on doors, people know you're coming for this election stuff, so it's not like generally a surprise. But I hear a lot of people are nervous about it, and I'm hearing that way more than I ever have before. And the reason why is because of these shootings. And, in Michigan State, you had that terrible shooting a few months ago. And then it seems as if the state acted. Your state legislature acted on gun issues. You passed some laws. It looks as though you're poised to do more even. Can you talk about some of the work that the state has done on gun violence in the last few months?
Yeah, I think what you've seen in Michigan is really what happens when a community comes together impacted by gun violence and then working to overcome it and through policies that are part of the solution, but not all of the solution. So we've seen in the aftermath of the tragedy at Michigan State, a number of gun safety laws enacted, from red flag laws to requiring firearms that are stored and left unattended to be locked or stored with a locking device, to particularly increasing the criminal penalty if firearms are not protected from child access. We've also seen bills to lower the costs of firearm safety devices to ensure owners can safely store their guns and keep them away from children, and also closing loopholes in the law to expand universal background checks to all firearms. So there's a beginning of a number of policies to increase the safety of our state. Because of these new laws, those looking to buy a gun in our state have to pass a background check. Every gun owner will be required to safely store their weapon. But I think it's important to see this as just the beginning. And in my view, we really need kind of a wraparound approach to increasing gun safety in our state. It's got to include increased protections and changes to our laws, as well as engaging other community leaders in helping to create safe environments. And so we're looking from the executive side on ways that we can do that and engage everyone from business leaders to community leaders to faith leaders to academic and educational leaders and to voters and citizens themselves, taking ownership over safety in all of our communities and building those safer environments. But because it's going to take everyone to really ensure, even beyond these policies, that we're creating an environment in Michigan where, as it should be, you're safe, whether you go to send your kids to school or walk around your neighborhood or church or go to the movies. But we're just getting started. And I think all of us have a lot more work to do to ensure we get to a place where everyone can feel that safe anywhere they go in the state.
We do obviously a lot of work with gun owners, and one of the reasons is the vast majority of gun owners favor many of the reforms that you've just mentioned. They're just very often shouted down by the minority of gun owners that have the loudest voices. In Michigan, how do you perceive where gun owners are on some of these reforms?
I think the vast majority of citizens, gun owners and non-gun owners in our state, support these very common sense policies that simply keep us all safe without infringing on anyone's rights, and really further the government's interest in safety of not just kids, but all of us in all aspects of our community. So we're seeing a lot of support, but also certainly a lot of, politically charged environments in which, there has been opposition expressed, but it's been muted in part because of the shootings at Michigan State and the tragedy at Michigan State and the tragedy at Oxford High School, just in many ways affected. There are students who were part of both Oxford High School
Right.
and the Michigan State tragedy, and so that has, I think, in some ways brought more people to the table in recognizing that we have to do something and we're going to do something, which has been hopeful. But of course, it shouldn't take tragedies and the tragic loss of life in order to get people to the table to actually protect our communities.
I think I heard somebody testify in your state legislature who had been at both of those shootings, which is just unbelievable.
It's going to the violence we're seeing on college campuses and in schools across America that we've seen for far too long is going to have and is already having the effect of mobilizing an entire generation that will stand to inherit our government and our democracy. Young voters who will be ensuring, I have full confidence, that we have safe environments, safe from gun violence and other types of violence as well, that they have had to endure as a result of the inaction of past generations. So I'm hopeful in this moment, but it is young voters and young citizens who sadly have been on the front lines of a lot of this
Yeah.
violence who will lead us out of this. And that's where it gets back to the democracy reforms. If we have a democracy that makes it more convenient, accessible, and safe and easy for young citizens to participate, then it opens the path for them to be active members in solving these issues.
We had on, and I know you've heard him speak too, Maxwell Frost, the congressman from Florida, who's like 26 years old, and his impetus for running for office was being around gun violence. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true, which is that the generation coming up, the next group of leaders, a lot of these people are going to have seen gun violence firsthand, something that's different than what a lot of older voters have experienced, and they're going to come into office with that in mind and that top of mind. I also, Secretary, saw a recent poll, I think it was Pew that did the study, that said that Republican women, their number one issue is gun violence. Republican women, which is, that's significant. And I think as we head toward the next elections. Listen, you do a great job. You don't need me to tell you. You're the best. We always say about you that you're the best. Am I allowed to brag about you on here? Can I brag about you? You're the best elected official in the country. So we thank you, and thank you for taking the time. I know you're super busy. You're doing amazing work in Michigan and really for democracy. Between the DMV and democracy, you're doing an incredible job. And thank you.
Thank you. We just want to make government work for everyone. That's the way it should be. We just want everyone to participate and have a voice that's heard. That's the way it's the principles our country was founded on. So I'm proud to be a part of making that real for every
Thank
citizen
you.
in our state.
And then we ask, Secretary, when people are with us, to tag another guest, somebody they think that we should talk to about the gun issue. Who do you recommend that we speak with?
There are two congresswomen in my state, Haley Stevens and Hillary Scholten, who have really been on the front lines at
Yeah.
the federal level and partnering with us in the state. So part of our story is not just what we're doing in the state, but part of who we send to Washington, what they're doing. And so I think having them on would really also add to our story. And when it comes to defending democracy and protecting the safety of voters, my dear friend and colleague, Katie Hobbs, who's now the governor of Arizona, is doing great work too. So I tag all three of those great women leaders, and I hope they can come on your show.
They're terrific. Haley from Pontiac and Hillary from Grand Rapids. They're doing a great job. We do talk to them on Capitol Hill a lot, and they're doing great work there as well. So thank you, Secretary Benson. We'll see you soon, and appreciate you doing this. Thank you for joining us.
Having me.
And now for Dr. Siegel with Siegel Scope.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to another edition of Siegel Scope. Today, I want to talk about a court case that has just been accepted by the Supreme Court and will be heard by the court, and that is United States versus Rahimi. And I also want to talk about a recent case that was just decided by a federal district court in the state of Oregon. And I want to tie the two together and explain how the Oregon decision may affect or help us to figure out what the Supreme Court potentially might rule in the Rahimi case. So first of all, the Rahimi case, basically, there was a man named Rahimi in Texas. He was under a domestic violence restraining order. that disallowed him by federal law from owning or possessing a firearm. The police were called to his house for a separate suspected offense. And while they were in the house, they noticed that he had a firearm. They seized it and charged him with illegal possession of a firearm under federal law because he was subject to a domestic violence restraining order and therefore not allowed under federal law to own a firearm. He filed suit claiming that this law was unconstitutional under the new Bruen guidelines. And it basically went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that court ruled in favor of Rahimi and said that the federal prohibition on gun possession by people who are subject to a domestic violence restraining order is not constitutional under Bruen because there is no historical precedent for such a restriction. And as I explained in a previous episode, under Bruen, the new standard that courts must use to determine whether or not laws violate the Second Amendment is whether or not there is a historical precedent or historical analogy for that type of law, that type of restriction on Second Amendment rights. So the big question here is, what is the Supreme Court going to decide? And I first want to stress how important their decision is for two reasons. First, if they decide that this law is unconstitutional, it's going to wreak havoc with the protection of the public from gun violence. Laws that prohibit domestic violence offenders from and people subject to domestic violence restraining orders from bearing arms are one of the most important laws that we have that protect people, usually women, from abusers. There is extremely strong evidence that these laws, including research that I myself have published, that these laws are extremely effective and that they reduce domestic violence fatality rates. So if this law is struck down, it's going to wreak havoc with protection just by virtue of invalidating all of those laws. But it's also going to have a second effect, which is going to basically set a precedent for how Bruen is to be interpreted. This will be essentially the first case that the Supreme Court hears since Bruen, and it was going to give us some idea of how the court is going to interpret Bruen. How broadly do they view this requirement for a historical analogy? Does it have to be an exact replica of the law that is being passed now? Or can it be somewhat analogous? How much room is there in terms of interpreting the analogy? Is it a very, very strict? Are they going to look at it very strictly, or are they going to look at it more broadly? That we're going to find out in this decision, and that will basically tell us in the future how this is going to be interpreted. Something happened just a couple of weeks ago that I think may have an impact, or at least may give us an idea how the court might rule and what they might consider. So on July 14th, a federal district judge in Oregon reached a decision on a case in Oregon that was brought by the Oregon Firearms Federation against the state of Oregon, challenging the constitutionality of Oregon's ban on large capacity ammunition magazines, which was enacted by the voters as Measure 114 during the 2020 election. And the Firearms Federation challenged this law's constitutionality under Bruen. So I want to briefly go over the decision that this judge made, and I want to quote extensively from her decision because I think the points that she makes are very important to understand and shed light on what we might expect from the Supreme Court. So the basic decision is, quote, This court finds that the defendants, the state of Oregon, has established that Oregon's restrictions on the use and possession of large capacity magazines are consistent with the nation's history and tradition of firearm regulation. Consequently, Oregon's large capacity magazine restrictions are constitutional under the Second Amendment. So this is an important decision. A federal court is using Bruen and under Bruen ruling that large capacity magazine ammunition bans are still constitutional, that they don't violate the Second Amendment. So let's go a little bit more in detail into why the judge made this decision. She says, under Bruen, the government must affirmatively prove that the challenge regulation is consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation. So she directly analyzed this case in light of Bruen. But she says, Bruen also made clear that the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited and that governments may still impose certain restrictions on the purchase, possession, and use of firearms. The Second Amendment allows a variety of gun regulations, including presumptively lawful regulatory measures such as laws prohibiting the keeping and carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. While Bruen's test for Second Amendment challenges is grounded in history and tradition, Bruen also acknowledged that modern regulations may implicate either unprecedented societal concerns or dramatic technological changes that are different from those that existed at the Second Amendment's ratification in 1791. In those circumstances, Bruen directs courts to consider a more nuanced approach and to determine whether the historical regulations are, quote, relevantly similar, not exact, but relevantly similar to the historical law. And she basically decides that the large capacity magazine restrictions are consistent with the history of firearm regulation. She writes, when a challenge regulation addresses a general societal problem that has persisted since the 18th century, the lack of a distinctly similar historical regulation addressing that problem is relevant evidence that the challenge regulation is consistent with the Second Amendment. Or if earlier generations addressed the problem but did so through materially different means, then it would be unconstitutional. But neither of the case is the case here, because domestic violence was not a regulated crime back in the colonial period. There were no laws against a man abusing his wife. That was considered part of his prerogative, I guess, back in those times. And so because domestic violence was not a crime, there was no way that society could have laws prohibiting people who committed domestic violence from owning firearms, or in particular, domestic violence restraining orders. There was no such thing as a domestic violence restraining order. So it would have been impossible for there to have been a law that restrained, that said that people who are under restraining orders for domestic violence couldn't own or possess a firearm. The judge writes, but if an instrument of self-defense did not exist or was exceedingly rare in 1791, as in the case of domestic violence, we would not expect to find any regulations limiting or restricting the possession or use of this rare or non-existent instrument. The Supreme Court thus clarified its rule in Bruen to account for technology or societal ills that founders could not have envisioned. And so founders could not have envisioned that domestic violence would one day be a crime and that there would be a provision for obtaining restraining orders and that laws then may be passed to restrict firearm possession under those circumstances. The judge says that in assessing whether a modern day regulation is relevantly similar to a historical analog, Bruen notes that the government must identify a well-established and representative historical analog, not a historical twin. Even if a modern day regulation is not a dead ringer for historical precursors, it still may be analogous enough to pass constitutional muster. And here's the clincher. She says, under Bruen, a more nuanced analogical approach is necessary if a case implicates either unprecedented societal concerns or dramatic technological changes. So in the case of the large capacity magazines, we're talking about a dramatic technological change that couldn't have been foreseen back then. And that's why the judge upheld the large capacity magazine ban. Now, what does this have to do with Rahimi? Well, in Rahimi, you're not talking about a dramatic technological change, but you are talking about an unprecedented societal concern. In other words, the concern for domestic violence is unprecedented compared to in colonial era. In the colonial era, this could not have been anticipated and was unprecedented. There was no precedent at that time for regulation of domestic violence, and certainly no precedent for the issuance of restraining orders to particular individuals. And so under the same reasoning that the federal court is using here, the Supreme Court has an opening to provide a more broader interpretation of its decision in Bruen. The judge here writes that at the trial, the defendants presented credible evidence about several types of historical analogs that imposed a comparable burden on the right to self-defense as the large capacity magazine ban. She talks about regulations on the use of trap guns, the storage of gunpowder, the possession of blunt objects like clubs, the possession and carrying of certain types of fighting knives, the concealed carrying of pistols, the concealed carrying of revolvers, and the use and possession of fully automatic and semi-automatic firearms. And that she finds sufficient to serve as an analogy. Certainly, there are many, many examples of regulations from the colonial times of regulations designed to keep firearms out of the hands of people who are viewed as dangerous at that time. And it will not be difficult, I think, for the Supreme Court to find that there is a historical tradition of regulation of firearm possession by people who have certain strong risk factors for violence. In fact, in Bruen itself, the court essentially ruled that permits are acceptable, are constitutional, concealed carry permits. The only thing they ruled out there was having a concealed carry permit where you must show that you have a specific reason or a specialized reason for owning a gun. But the court basically is okay with the general idea of permits for people who are criminals, essentially, and therefore pose a high risk of danger. So, although obviously one cannot predict what the court is going to do, and particularly this Supreme Court, I think this federal court decision is extremely important because it paves the way, it shows a way that courts can now interpret Bruen in a way that is a little bit broader than many people have been talking about, and in a way that really upholds most of the central firearm regulations that we have in this country that don't unduly or directly interfere with people's right to own a particular type of firearm for self-defense, or to have special requirements in order for the right to be granted. So I think that there's a very good possibility that the Supreme Court will use a similar type of reasoning to say that, look, there was no domestic violence back in the colonial times. Therefore, this is a new, unprecedented concern. There couldn't have been any regulations against it. And the type of regulation that it represents is something that did exist because there were many regulations that prohibited firearm possession by people who were viewed as dangerous at that time. And finally, the degree that it interferes with people's Second Amendment rights is not much different from the degree to which those historical analogs interfere with people's right to own guns. In fact, those laws prohibited people completely from owning guns if they were deemed to be a danger to society. And this law does exactly the same thing. It's in very, very similar, if not exact analog. I know that was a lot to take in, but I think it's really critical because of the importance of this decision. And I think that this federal court decision is very important for people to understand. It was just issued a couple weeks ago, and there hasn't been much publicity about it. So I hope that this edition of Siegel Scope has given you a updated perspective on the current status of jurisprudence in gun regulation. Thanks for watching, and it's back to you, Matt.
I'm Mathew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of TAG on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.